Racist waiter targets woman only to find out she's married to the owner. The restaurant hummed with the soft clinking of glasses and the muffled chatter of diners. It was the kind of upscale place where the warm golden light seemed to cast a glow over everyone inside, making them feel a little more important for the evening. The scent of freshly baked bread mingled with the rich aroma of garlic, butter, and herbs, setting the perfect stage for a memorable night out. At least, it should have been. She walked in quietly, her presence understated but undeniable. Dressed with an elegance that whispered confidence rather than shouted it, she carried herself as someone accustomed to grace but never flaunting it. Her eyes scanned the room, searching for a familiar face, her expression calm but observant. She wasn't alone, though she moved as if she didn't need anyone to back her up. For her, the restaurant wasn't just another dining spot. It held a deeper significance, though no one around her would have guessed. Behind the polished counter, a waiter stood stiffly, his crisp uniform barely disguising the tension in his posture. He glanced at her once, then twice, his lips tightening into a thin, disapproving line. He leaned over to whisper something to a colleague, and though his words were too low to carry, his sneers spoke volumes. Something about her, perhaps the way she looked, the confidence she exuded, or maybe just his own prejudices, had triggered a reaction he wasn't bothering to hide. As she approached the host's stand, he stepped forward with deliberate precision, his expression shifting into one of forced politeness. It was the kind of look that didn't quite reach the eyes, the kind that made you feel more like an inconvenience than a guest. "Do you have a reservation?" he asked, his tone cool, almost dismissive. She smiled, her voice warm and measured. "I'm meeting someone. My husband should already be here." The waiter raised an eyebrow, skepticism flashing across his face. He didn't ask her husband's name, didn't bother to check the reservation list. Instead, he made a show of glancing around the dining area as though searching for a man who fit some unspoken image he had in mind. "I don't see anyone waiting for you," he said flatly, his tone carrying just enough condescension to make it clear he wasn't interested in helping. The woman's smile faltered, but only for a moment. She glanced around herself, her gaze sharp and unwavering. "Perhaps I'll just wait at the bar," she suggested, her voice steady, though a subtle tension had crept into it. But the waiter wasn't done. "Actually," he said, stepping in her path, "we're quite busy tonight. The bar's really for patrons who are dining. If you're just waiting, maybe it's better to step outside?" The implication hung heavy in the air. Around them, a few nearby diners turned their heads, sensing the friction but unsure of the context. She stood still, her expression unreadable, as though deciding whether to push back or let it slide. A flicker of frustration crossed her features, but she quickly masked it, unwilling to give him the satisfaction of seeing her upset. "I'm quite sure my husband is here," she said firmly, her voice carrying a quiet authority. "He's expecting me." The waiter's smile twisted into something sharper, colder. "I'll double-check, but like I said, we're very busy." With that, he turned on his heel and disappeared into the kitchen, leaving her standing alone in the middle of the bustling restaurant. A minute passed, then two. Diners came and went, servers bustled by with trays of food, but the waiter didn't return. She stood her ground, refusing to let the moment rattle her. But the longer she waited, the more evident it became that he wasn't coming back anytime soon. Eventually, another staff member approached her, a younger woman with a kind face and an apologetic smile. "Can I help you?" she asked, her tone genuinely concerned. "I'm here to meet my husband," the woman replied, her voice softening slightly in response to the younger server's kindness. "But it seems there's been a misunderstanding." The server nodded quickly. "Let me check for you," she said, hurrying off toward the dining area. Within seconds she returned, her face lighting up with recognition. "Yes, he's right over there. Follow me." Relief flickered across the woman's face as she followed the server through the crowded restaurant. They stopped at a table near the back, where a man sat waiting, his expression brightening the moment he saw her. He stood, pulling her into a warm embrace before gesturing for her to sit. The young server lingered for a moment, smiling at the reunion before excusing herself to grab menus. But as she walked away, the original waiter reappeared, his face pale and his movements stiff. His gaze darted toward the table, and it was clear from the way he hesitated that he had suddenly realized his mistake. The man seated across from the woman, the one she had confidently claimed as her husband, was not just another diner. He was the owner of the restaurant. The waiter froze, his mind racing as the implications of his behavior hit him. He had not just been rude, he had targeted the wife of the man who signed his paychecks. Panic started to creep into his expression, though he quickly tried to mask it, knowing there was no way to undo the damage he had already caused. But the woman? She simply leaned back in her chair, her eyes locking onto the waiter with a quiet intensity that said more than words ever could. There was no need for raised voices or accusations. The truth of the situation hung heavy in the air, and everyone in the room could feel it. The waiter shifted uncomfortably on his feet, his confidence from earlier now replaced by a growing sense of dread. He stole a glance at the couple, then quickly looked away, hoping they hadn't noticed him lingering. But they had. The woman's gaze was steady, unblinking, and the man sitting across from her had turned slightly, his expression unreadable. If there was tension between them, it wasn't immediately visible. They seemed calm, almost too calm, which only made the waiter's nerves worse. As the woman leaned forward to speak with her husband, her voice dropped just enough that the words didn't carry to anyone nearby. Whatever she was saying wasn't for public ears, and the waiter's curiosity burned even as his panic grew. Did she tell him what happened? Would she mention the way he had spoken to her, the way he had tried to send her outside like she didn't belong? He didn't know, but the uncertainty gnawed at him. The man nodded slowly as she spoke, his expression shifting slightly as he listened. There was no anger, no immediate outburst, just a quiet intensity that made it impossible to guess what he was thinking. When she finished, he sat back in his chair, folding his hands in front of him, his eyes drifting over the restaurant. His gaze landed on the waiter, who flinched involuntarily before quickly looking away. In the kitchen, the staff bustled about, oblivious to the tension brewing out front. The waiter ducked behind the counter, pretending to busy himself with polishing glasses, though his trembling hands made the task more difficult than it should have been. He wanted to run, to disappear before the consequences of his actions caught up with him. But he couldn't. Not without making things worse. The woman's presence lingered in his mind, a quiet yet undeniable challenge to everything he had assumed when she walked in. She didn't fit into the box he had tried to put her in. Her composure, her calmness in the face of his hostility, it unnerved him. She hadn't raised her voice, hadn't demanded anything. And yet, she had completely unraveled his confidence with nothing more than her presence. At their table, the couple's conversation seemed to grow quieter, more deliberate. The woman occasionally glanced around the room, her expression unreadable but far from passive. She wasn't just sitting idly by. She was observing, taking everything in, and the waiter had the sinking feeling that she missed nothing. The younger server who had helped her earlier approached the table, her smile warm and genuine as she handed them menus. The woman thanked her with a small nod, her tone polite and measured, but there was a subtle shift in her posture that made it clear she hadn't forgotten the earlier slight. She didn't need to call attention to it. The weight of what had happened hung over the room like a storm cloud, invisible but undeniable. Meanwhile, the waiter's thoughts churned. How had he misread her so badly? He replayed the moment she walked in, searching for clues that might have tipped him off to who she was. But nothing stood out. She hadn't announced herself, hadn't demanded special treatment. If anything, she had carried herself with the quiet assurance of someone who didn't need to. And yet he had still managed to turn her into a target. As the minutes ticked by, the tension only seemed to grow. The waiter found himself sneaking glances at the table, unable to shake the feeling that they were talking about him. Every time the man leaned in slightly to whisper something, the waiter's heart sank further. He could feel the walls closing in, and he wasn't sure how much longer he could take it. But the couple didn't make a scene. They didn't call for him or demand an explanation. Instead, they remained calm, their conversation punctuated by occasional glances in his direction. It was almost worse than if they had confronted him outright. The waiting, the not knowing it was unbearable. In the background, the restaurant hummed along as usual. Diners chatted over their meals, oblivious to the drama unfolding in their midst. The kitchen staff worked with practiced efficiency, plates of food emerging from the swinging doors like clockwork. But for the waiter, everything seemed to move in slow motion. Every sound was magnified, every movement exaggerated. It felt as though the entire world had shrunk to the space between him and the table at the back of the room. Finally, the man stood, his movements deliberate but unhurried. He adjusted his jacket and glanced at his wife, who gave him a small nod in return. The waiter's heart skipped a beat as the man began walking toward the counter, his steps measured and purposeful. He tried to busy himself, pretending not to notice, but there was no avoiding it. The man was coming straight for him. When he stopped at the counter, the waiter could barely meet his eyes. There was no anger in his expression, no sign of the confrontation the waiter had been bracing for. Instead, there was something far more unsettling, quiet disappointment. It was the kind of look that made you feel small, not because someone else had belittled you, but because you had done it to yourself. "We need to talk," the man said, his voice low and calm. The waiter nodded quickly, fumbling for words that wouldn't come. "Why, yes, sir," he stammered, his face flushing with embarrassment. The man's gaze didn't waver. "Not here," he said simply, gesturing toward the back. The waiter followed him reluctantly, his legs feeling like lead. The short walk to the office felt like an eternity, each step weighted with the knowledge that his actions had consequences he couldn't escape. Behind him, the dining room buzzed on, unaware of the reckoning taking place just a few feet away. When they reached the office, the man closed the door behind them, the soft click of the latch echoing in the small space. He turned to face the waiter, his expression unreadable. For a moment, neither of them spoke. The silence stretched between them, heavy and unyielding. The waiter opened his mouth to apologize, but the man held up a hand, stopping him. "Let me make one thing clear," he said, his tone even but firm. "This isn't just about what happened tonight. This is about what kind of place we are, what kind of experience we want to create for everyone who walks through those doors." The waiter swallowed hard, his chest tightening. He wanted to explain, to defend himself, but he couldn't find the words. He knew there was no excuse for how he had treated her, no way to undo the harm he had caused. "I built this restaurant on respect," the man continued, his voice steady. "Respect for our staff, our customers, and the values that make us better. What you did tonight wasn't just disrespectful, it was unacceptable." The words hit like a punch to the gut, but the waiter couldn't argue. He had no defense, no justification. All he could do was stand there, shame washing over him like a tidal wave. "You have a choice to make," the man said finally, his gaze unwavering. "You can learn from this, grow from it, or you can let it define you. But what you can't do is ignore it." The waiter nodded slowly, the weight of his mistake sinking in. He knew there was no easy way forward, no quick fix for what he had done. But as he stood there, face to face with the man he had wronged, he realized that this moment was a turning point, a chance to be better, or a reason to stay the same. For now, the tension remained unresolved, the path ahead unclear. But one thing was certain, the woman he had dismissed so easily was far more than she seemed, and the lesson she had taught him would not be forgotten. The waiter left the office with his head down, feeling the weight of the owner's words pressing on him. The man hadn't raised his voice once, but the disappointment had cut deeper than any shouting ever could. Back in the dining room, the restaurant carried on as if nothing had happened. Plates clattered, glasses clinked, and soft laughter drifted through the air. But for the waiter, Everything felt muted, the vibrant atmosphere dulled by the turmoil in his mind. He couldn't stop replaying the moment she had walked in, the way he had judged her without hesitation. How could he have been so wrong, so quick to assume? He wanted to make it right somehow, but he wasn't sure if that was even possible. Would an apology be enough? Did she even want to hear it? The questions swirled in his head, each one heavier than the last. The woman remained seated at the back of the restaurant, her posture still calm and composed. Her husband had returned to their table, and the two of them were speaking quietly, their expressions unreadable. She didn't look angry, but there was a quiet strength in her demeanor that made the waiter feel small. She hadn't demanded an explanation, hadn't caused a scene, and yet her presence alone was enough to keep him on edge. Every time the waiter passed their table, he could feel her eyes on him, though she never said a word. It was as if she was waiting for him to make the first move, to own up to what he had done. But he hesitated, fear holding him back. What if she didn't accept his apology? What if he made things worse? The uncertainty was almost unbearable. As the evening wore on, the restaurant began to empty out. The hum of conversation grew quieter, and the once bustling dining room started to feel strangely intimate. The waiter couldn't avoid the couple much longer. Their table was one of the last occupied, and every glance in their direction felt like a reminder that he needed to face what he had done. He gathered his courage, rehearsing what he might say in his head. He would apologize sincerely, take responsibility for his actions, and hope they could see that he truly regretted his behavior. But when he finally approached their table, his hands trembling slightly, he found himself at a loss for words. "Excuse me," he said softly, his voice barely above a whisper. Both the man and the woman looked up at him, their expressions calm but expectant. The waiter cleared his throat, his palms slick with nervous sweat. I wanted to say I'm sorry. For earlier. For the way I treated you." The woman's gaze didn't waver. She studied him for a moment, her silence stretching out uncomfortably. The waiter felt his heart pounding in his chest, the weight of her stare almost too much to bear. "I shouldn't have assumed anything about you," he continued, his words tumbling out in a rush. "It was wrong, and it wasn't fair. I let my own biases get in the way, and I'm really, truly sorry." The silence that followed was deafening. The waiter held his breath, waiting for her response. Would she forgive him? Or would she call him out, make him confront the full extent of his mistake in front of everyone? Finally, she spoke, her voice steady but firm. "Do you understand why what you did was wrong?" she asked, her tone free of anger but heavy with meaning. The waiter nodded quickly. "Yes. I judged you without knowing anything about you. I treated you differently because of how you look, and that was completely unacceptable." Her expression softened slightly, though she still seemed to be measuring his sincerity. "It's not just about me," she said quietly. "It's about anyone who walks through those doors. Everyone deserves to be treated with respect, no matter who they are or what you think you know about them." The waiter swallowed hard, her words hitting him like a punch to the gut. She wasn't just talking about herself, she was making a point about the kind of place the restaurant should be, the kind of person he should strive to be. "I understand," he said finally, his voice thick with emotion. "And I promise I'll do better." She nodded once, her gaze softening further. "I hope you will." The waiter felt a rush of relief, though it was tempered by the knowledge that words alone wouldn't be enough. He had to prove himself through his actions, not just to her but to everyone who came through the restaurant. As he turned to walk away, the man at the table spoke up, his voice calm but commanding. "Take care of the next table yourself," he said, gesturing to the last remaining party in the dining room. The waiter hesitated for a moment, then nodded, understanding the significance of the request. It wasn't just about serving a table, it was about showing that he could learn, that he could change. He squared his shoulders and approached the diners with a renewed sense of purpose, determined to prove that he was capable of more than the mistakes he had made. But even as he went about his duties, the tension in the room remained. The woman's quiet strength and the man's calm authority had left an indelible mark on him, a reminder that every action had consequences, and every choice carried weight. The night wasn't over yet, and the resolution to this conflict still hung in the air, waiting for the final moments to unfold. The waiter finished serving the last table, doing his best to remain calm and composed, though his mind was still racing. He felt the weight of every move he made, every word he spoke, as if the eyes of the entire restaurant were on him. Even though the couple in the back had turned their attention back to their conversation, he couldn't shake the feeling that the night was far from over. The tension in the air was subtle but unrelenting, and he knew something was still coming, something he couldn't quite predict. As he returned to the counter, the man stood up again. This time, he carried a quiet but firm purpose, the kind that made everyone around him instinctively pay attention. The woman stayed seated, watching him leave the table, her expression unreadable. The man walked toward the waiter, and for a brief moment, the waiter thought he was about to be given another reprimand, another stern reminder of his mistake. But as the man approached, his attention shifted. He wasn't looking at the waiter. He was looking at the other side of the dining room. The waiter followed his gaze and froze. At the entrance of the restaurant stood a man in an impeccably tailored suit. He had the kind of presence that turned heads without trying, the kind that made people sit up straighter without knowing why. His expression was calm, almost too calm, and his sharp eyes scanned the room as if he were searching for something or someone. The room seemed to hold its breath as he stepped inside. His movements were deliberate, each step confident but measured, and the energy in the room shifted. The man from the table walked over to him, and the two exchanged a quiet greeting, their words too low for anyone else to hear. The waiter couldn't tell if they were friends or strangers, but there was a familiarity in the way they acknowledged each other, a subtle tension that hinted at unspoken history. After a brief exchange, the man in the suit scanned the room again, his gaze landing on the woman at the table. For a split second, something flickered across his face, recognition, perhaps, or something more complicated. The waiter noticed it immediately, though he couldn't decipher what it meant. The man in the suit nodded once, and the other man gestured toward the table, inviting him to join them. The woman didn't seem surprised when the man in the suit approached. In fact, she looked as though she had been expecting him. She stood as he reached the table, and they exchanged a quiet, formal greeting. The way they interacted was subtle but charged, a conversation happening just beneath the surface. The waiter could only watch from a distance, his curiosity growing by the second. Who was this man, and what was his connection to the couple? The man in the suit sat down at their table, and the three of them began to talk. Their voices were low, their expressions controlled, but the tension between them was palpable. It wasn't the kind of tension that came from anger or hostility, it was deeper, more complex, as if they were discussing something that carried enormous weight. The waiter couldn't help but feel like an outsider looking in on something he wasn't meant to see. He busied himself clearing plates and wiping down tables, trying not to let his curiosity show, but his ears strained to catch fragments of their conversation. He couldn't hear much, just the occasional word or phrase, but what he did hear only deepened the mystery. Timing couldn't be worse, the man in the suit said, his tone low but insistent. Not about timing, the woman replied, her voice calm but firm. It's about doing what's right. The other man, the restaurant owner, leaned forward slightly, his voice too soft for the waiter to hear. Whatever he said seemed to carry weight, though, because the man in the suit frowned, his jaw tightening as he listened. The waiter's hands shook as he stacked the last of the plates onto his tray. He didn't know what was happening, but he could feel it building, like the charged air before a storm. There was something bigger at play here, something that went beyond a simple misunderstanding or an apology. And somehow, he had become part of it, whether he wanted to be or not. As the night wore on, the tension in the room didn't dissipate. If anything, it grew sharper, more focused. The three at the table remained locked in conversation, their voices low but urgent, their expressions shifting between concern and resolve. The waiter felt a strange mix of fear and curiosity, unable to tear his eyes away but dreading what he might discover. Finally, the man in the suit stood, his movements deliberate. He reached into his pocket and pulled out a sleek black envelope, placing it on the table in front of the woman. Her expression didn't change as she picked it up, her fingers brushing the edge of the envelope with practiced ease. She didn't open it right away, instead setting it aside and meeting the man's gaze with a quiet intensity. The man in the suit nodded once, his expression softening ever so slightly. Then, without another word, he turned and walked out of the restaurant, his departure as commanding as his arrival. The door swung shut behind him, and the room seemed to exhale all at once, the tension breaking like a wave. But for the waiter, the unease remained. He couldn't stop thinking about the envelope, about the strange dynamic between the three at the table. He didn't know what was inside, but he had the sinking feeling that whatever it was, it had the power to change everything. As the couple prepared to leave, the woman glanced at the waiter one last time. Her expression was calm, almost kind, but there was something in her eyes, a warning, perhaps, or a reminder that made his stomach tighten. He watched as they gathered their things and left the restaurant, the envelope clutched tightly in her hand. The dining room was empty now, the lights dimmed, and the quiet felt heavier than usual. The waiter stood behind the counter, staring at the door long after it had closed. He didn't know what had just happened or why, but one thing was certain: this night wasn't over. Not yet. The night ended quietly, but the waiter couldn't shake the sense of unease that had settled deep in his chest. He went through the closing routine in a haze, his thoughts circling back to the woman, her husband, and the mysterious man in the suit. He kept replaying the interactions in his head, searching for clues, for something that would explain what he had witnessed. But no matter how hard he tried, he couldn't piece it together. As he locked the front door and stepped out into the cool night air, he noticed the couple standing near a sleek black car parked under the street lamp. The woman was holding the envelope now, her fingers tracing its edge absent-mindedly as her husband leaned against the car, speaking in low tones. For a moment, the waiter considered walking the other way, pretending he hadn't seen them. But something held him there, a strange pull, as if he were on the verge of understanding something important. The woman glanced up and saw him standing by the door. Her expression didn't change, but there was a flicker of recognition in her eyes, a quiet acknowledgement that made his heart race. She said something to her husband, who nodded before turning to look at the waiter as well. The man's face was calm, but his gaze carried a weight that made it clear this wasn't a casual moment. The waiter hesitated, unsure whether to approach or retreat. But before he could decide, the woman stepped forward, closing the distance between them with measured steps. She stopped a few feet away, the envelope still in her hand, and studied him in silence. The weight of her gaze was almost unbearable, and he felt his pulse quicken as he waited for her to speak. "You're still here," she said finally, her voice soft but steady. It wasn't a question, more of an observation, but it carried an undercurrent of meaning he couldn't quite decipher. I wanted to apologize again," he said, stumbling over his words. "For everything. I know I can't take it back, but I meant what I said. I want to do better." Her expression softened slightly, and she nodded. "I believe you," she said. "But words only go so far. It's your actions that matter now." He nodded quickly, relief washing over him at her words. But before he could say anything else, she extended the envelope toward him. His eyes widened in surprise, and he looked at her uncertainly, unsure of what to do. "Take it," she said, her tone firm but not unkind. The waiter hesitated for a moment before reaching out to accept the envelope. It felt heavier than he expected, and the glossy black paper was cool against his fingers. He glanced at her, searching her face for some kind of explanation, but she offered none. "Open it when you're ready," she said, stepping back toward the car. "But remember, sometimes the truth isn't what you expect." With that, she turned and joined her husband by the car. The two of them got in and drove away, leaving the waiter standing alone under the street lamp, the envelope clutched tightly in his hand. He stared at it for what felt like an eternity, his mind racing with possibilities. What could be inside? A letter? A warning? Something that would change everything? His fingers trembled as he broke the seal, the sound of tearing paper echoing in the still night air. Inside was a single folded piece of paper and a small key attached to a silver chain. He unfolded the paper, his eyes scanning the words written in neat, deliberate handwriting. As he read, his breath caught in his throat, and his heart began to pound. The letter was from the man in the suit. It explained that the woman wasn't just the wife of the owner, she was also the majority shareholder in the restaurant, the one who had provided the funding to make it a reality. The man in the suit was her brother, sent to deliver the key to a safe deposit box containing documents that outlined the restaurant's true ownership structure. The waiter's earlier assumptions had missed the mark entirely. She wasn't just connected to the restaurant, she was the restaurant, in a way he had never imagined. But the twist didn't end there. At the bottom of the letter was a single line that made his blood run cold: "You've been given a second chance. Use it wisely because we'll be watching." The waiter looked around, half expecting to see someone watching him from the shadows. But the street was empty, the night quiet except for the hum of distant traffic. He clutched the letter and the key tightly, his mind racing. He didn't know what the future held, but one thing was certain: his actions would matter more than ever now. The stakes had been raised, and the weight of his choices had never felt heavier. The waiter stood under the street lamp for a long time, the letter and key in his hand, his thoughts a tangled mess of confusion and clarity. He felt exposed, as though the letter's final words weren't just a warning but a spotlight shining directly on him. He couldn't shake the feeling that the woman, her husband, and the mysterious man in the suit had orchestrated something far bigger than he'd been able to comprehend. And somehow, he had become part of it. Walking home, the city felt eerily quiet. Each step echoed in his ears, giving him too much time to think. The key on the chain swung lightly in his grip, its small weight a reminder of the responsibility it represented. He didn't know what was in the safe deposit box, but he knew it had to be important enough for them to leave it with him. A second chance, they had called it. But why him? Why had they entrusted him with something so significant after the mistakes he'd made? The next morning, he woke with a heavy heart. His sleep had been restless, his dreams a chaotic mix of guilt and curiosity. The letters sat on his bedside table, the key resting on top. He picked them up, rereading the letter for what felt like the 100th time. The words didn't change, but their meaning seemed to grow heavier with each reading. Determined to find out the truth, he got dressed and made his way to the address listed at the bottom of the letter. It was a sleek, modern bank on the edge of the city, the kind of place that didn't advertise its presence but was known by those who needed it. As he stepped inside, the pristine interior and hushed atmosphere only added to his anxiety. A clerk greeted him with a polite smile, but the waiter barely noticed as he handed over the letter and key. The clerk examined them carefully before nodding and motioning for him to follow. They walked through a secure door into a private room filled with rows of safe deposit boxes. The clerk led him to one near the back, inserted the key into the lock, and stepped aside to give him privacy. With trembling hands, the waiter opened the box. Inside was a thick file folder, neatly organized, and a small velvet pouch. He opened the folder first, his eyes scanning the documents. They were legal papers, detailed and precise, outlining the restaurant's financials and ownership structure. The woman wasn't just a shareholder, she was the primary investor, her name listed on nearly every major decision. But there was something else, a handwritten note clipped to the top of the folder. Mistakes don't define you. What you do next does. Take these documents to the restaurant. Show them to my husband. He'll understand what needs to happen. He set the folder down, his hands shaking. He had no idea what kind of responsibility he had just been handed, but he knew one thing: the woman and her husband weren't just testing him. They were giving him an opportunity to prove he could rise above his past behavior. He opened the velvet pouch next, revealing a simple gold pin shaped like a key. It wasn't flashy or ornate, but it carried a quiet significance that made his chest tighten. The pin was accompanied by another note, much shorter this time, a reminder that doors open when you choose the right path. The message hit him harder than he expected. He thought about the assumptions he had made, the way he had treated the woman the first time she walked into the restaurant. That moment had felt so small at the time, a fleeting lapse in judgment. But now, he understood how much it had revealed about himself, and how much he needed to change. Later that day, he returned to the restaurant. It was early, hours before they opened, and the place was eerily quiet. The owner was there, sitting in the corner with a cup of coffee, his face unreadable as he watched the waiter approach. Without a word, the waiter handed him the folder and the gold pin. The man's expression shifted as he opened the folder, his eyes scanning the documents. He nodded slowly, as if confirming something he already knew, and set the folder down. "Do you know what this means?" the owner asked, his voice calm but firm. The waiter hesitated, unsure of how to answer. "I think so," he said finally. "It means I have a chance to make things right. To do better." The owner studied him for a long moment before nodding. "It also means she sees something in you," he said. "Something worth believing in. Don't let her down." The words carried a weight that settled heavily on the waiter's shoulders, but they also filled him with a quiet determination. He didn't know if he could live up to the faith they had placed in him, but he knew he had to try. Over the next few weeks, the waiter threw himself into his work with a renewed sense of purpose. He went out of his way to treat every customer with kindness and respect, no matter who they were or what they looked like. He listened more, assumed less, and made an effort to understand the people around him. It wasn't easy, change never was, but with each passing day, he felt himself growing into someone he could be proud of. The woman and her husband returned to the restaurant a few weeks later. This time, the waiter greeted them with a warm smile and led them to the best table in the house. There was no hesitation, no judgment, only genuine hospitality. The woman met his gaze and gave a small nod of approval, a silent acknowledgement of how far he had come. As they dined, the waiter noticed something he hadn't seen before: the way they interacted, the quiet respect and understanding that flowed between them. They weren't just partners in business, they were partners in life, each one supporting the other in ways that went beyond words. Watching them, he realized how much he had misunderstood that first night, how much he still had to learn about people and their stories. When they left, the woman handed him an envelope. His heart raced as he opened it, but inside was only a single piece of paper with 3 words written in elegant script: "You've earned it." The words stayed with him long after they had gone, a reminder of the journey he had taken and the person he was becoming. He knew he wasn't perfect, no one was, but he also knew he had the power to choose his path, to open doors and build bridges instead of closing himself off to the world. The gold pin rested in his pocket as he locked up the restaurant that night. It wasn't just a reminder of what he had been through, it was a symbol of the future he was working toward. And for the first time in a long time, he felt ready to face whatever came next.